say to my bride, let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. When I was going through school, I recall learning about vulcanized rubber, and I initially thought it had something to do with Star Trek. As it turned out, vulcanization was a process that made natural rubber usable for industrial applications. One of the more famous applications of this rubber is in making tires, and although the man that invented the process did not himself make tires, years later a company would take up his name and be a giant in the industry. So today we'll look at the man and the company, Goodyear. Rubber, or natural latex that can be extracted from certain trees, has been used by the peoples of South America for thousands of years. It is soft, sticky, and pliant, and the Mesoamerican peoples used it for a number of things, making small water bottles, insulating and waterproofing buildings, and even dipping their feet into a vat of the stuff so that it would form something like a tennis shoe that would keep one's feet dry in heavy rain. The stuff made it to Europe by the late 15th century and became something of a novelty. Indeed, a chemist by the name of Joseph Priestley was the man who first called it rubber in 1870, after noting that it would rub out pencil marks that were on a sheet of paper. But rubber was too soft, pliant, and unstable at high or low temperatures to have many practical uses, and so rubber remained just a novelty until the 19th century. In 1800, Charles Goodyear was born in New Haven, Connecticut. His father owned a local hardware store, and young Charles learned the business, partnering with his father by 1825. But alas, the concern fell on hard times, and the family business was defunct by 1830. Charles himself also became quite ill at the time, but did recover, though penniless. In 1831, Goodyear was introduced to rubber. He read an article about the stuff and that the Roxbury Rubber Company out of Boston had come up with some viable uses for it, the most prominent of them as a waterproofing material for use in life preservers. Goodyear did some of his own experiments, and by 1834 had invented a new type of valve for inflating rubber-lined life preservers. He took his invention to the Roxbury Company, and they were impressed. They also turned him down. They admitted that although the preservers worked initially, after a few months the natural latex would degrade and the life preservers became anchors. The company itself was in ruins and had no use for Goodyear's excellent invention. Charles saw the problem. Natural rubber was sticky and too soft to be molded. It had to be applied. Also, it was very unstable. When it gets too warm, it melts. Too cold, it becomes brittle and shatters. So he returned home from that meeting and was immediately arrested and thrown into debtor's prison. He was that broke. Yet, while there, he managed to get a bit of India rubber, which was cheap at the time, and worked some magnesium into it. That at least stopped it from being too sticky, and so he was encouraged. Once out of prison, he received the help of a few friends to continue the experiments. His whole household, wife, kids, and the shack they lived in, was converted into an experimental rubber factory. He focused on both his process and a product that could be produced, and he went with a non-sticky waterproof shoe liner. It did work initially, but like the life preservers, would fail after a few months. His friends backed out, and Goodyear was now both penniless and homeless. He sold just about everything he had left, put his family into a boarding house, and continued to work. He went to New York and befriended a local druggist who gave him space in his attic to experiment. Lots of various chemical compounds were available, and Goodyear experimented with just about all of them and made progress. His first success was dealing with the stickiness. Using calcium oxide, magnesium, and a heat treatment, the rubber became much easier to handle and garnered much attention. Goodyear seemed finally on the road to success he had worked so hard to get on. And for the next few years, Goodyear would reach out to old friends and continue to refine and improve rubber as well as uses for it. Clothes, shoes, maritime uses, and anything that needed something soft and non-sticky was envisioned, and with the money provided from people he knew that were enthusiastic, as he was, about the prospects of rubber, put these products into production and financial success seemed on the horizon. Then the panic of 1837 came, and with it the money his friends had. Charles was again flat broke. So he went to Boston and reconnected with an old friend from Roxbury and also gathered some new ones. One of them, a Mr. Chaffee, was also in the business and had designed machines to mix the latex more thoroughly and thus make a better product. Goodyear used this support to patent a new process for making shoes, and again, the future seemed bright. But the products just didn't last. The rubber would deteriorate quickly in cold temperatures, and any acids that got in contact with the rubber would make it sticky again. People sent back the things they bought after only a few months, and so the concern, once again, failed. By this point, Goodyear knew that the only way to really fix the problem was to fix rubber itself, to make it moldable, flexible, non-stick, and resilient to natural temperatures and acids. So he focused on this issue, experimenting with just about anything he could get his hands on. The real breakthrough came in 1839. The story goes that he was at a general store in Woburn, Massachusetts, where he was demonstrating the properties of his new rubber formula. The folks watching his demonstration actually laughed at him, and he became rather animated himself, gesturing wildly while holding the rubber, when he lost hold of it and it sailed through the air and landed on a hot stove. Moments later he grabbed it, but much of it stuck to the stove. Apologizing, he scraped off the rubber from the stovetop and noted that the rubber that had gotten really hot changed its properties. It was still flexible, but was both not sticky and held its form well. The secret ingredient he was lacking before was sulfur. This batch had some, but had not been heated to the extreme that the stovetop did. Returning to his shack of a home, he experimented further with this formula with a higher heat. He named the process of mixing and heating the rubber vulcanization, after the Roman god Vulcan, god of fire and brimstone and volcanoes, and patented it that same year. Charles spent the next 5 years perfecting his process, going back to debtor's prison for a spell, and finally receiving his U.S. patent for vulcanized rubber in 1844. He showed his new rubber everywhere he could and how it could be molded, will hold its shape and integrity in a very wide temperature range, is not sticky, and is resistant to acids, abrasions, and pressure. He had finally made rubber that could truly perform in the modern industrial world. Of course, his patent was abused and ignored by many of his competitors, and so most of the money he did make was eaten up by court costs. Charles Goodyear would pass away in 1860, leaving some $200,000 of debt behind him. He never prospered himself from the tireless work he did, yet through it all, he remained a man of integrity. Regarding those that tried, and some succeeded, to steal his patent, he remarked, quote, I am not disposed to complain that I have planted and others have gathered the fruits. A man has cause for regret only when he sows and no one reaps. One of the many men that would reap in the field that Goodyear had sown was Frank Seiberling. Frank was born in a small town on the outskirts of Akron, Ohio in 1859. His father, John, owned a small factory that fabricated and forged various machines for farm use, plows, threshers, harvesters, and such. The Seiberlings were prosperous and well known in Northeast Ohio. Frank studied engineering and business in college for a couple of years before joining the family business in 1881 as the financial officer. The Panic of 1893 hit Northeast Ohio very hard. Unemployment reached 55% in Cleveland and near the same in other cities in the region, including Akron. Economic recovery was slow, and some of the family business ventures failed as a result. By 1898, Frank Seiberling was in a situation not unlike what Charles Goodyear had faced many times. He was broke and out of work. But in Frank's case, that wouldn't last too long. He went to Chicago looking for business and ended up finding quite an opportunity. There were 2 empty factories sitting on Market Street in Akron, Ohio, along with some 7 acres of land they occupied. If you wanted to get into the manufacturing business in some manner, here were the buildings and land you needed to do it. All you needed was $13,500 and the whole kit and caboodle could be yours. Of course, Frank didn't have that kind of cash lying around, but he knew some folks that could help out. His brother-in-law, Lucius Miles, chipped in $3,500. His younger brother, Charles, also partnered with $3,000 more, and so the purchase was made. Frank had factories that all he had to do was figure out what to make, fill the factories and property with the tools and supplies to make something, hire the crews, and voila, we're in business. All this sounds good, but now a decision had to be made. What product or products are we going to make? Prior to the Panic of 1893, Akron was well known for steel foundries and ironworks. But after 5 years, that industry had not yet fully rebounded and was still unstable. However, another Ohioan, Dr. Benjamin Goodrich, had established a rubber company in Akron under his name in 1870. Originally making hoses, by 1898 they were making both bicycle and car tires. The first company in the USA to make car tires, and the rubber industry was starting to flourish in Akron. Frank looked at the overall economic situation and came to a decision. Since nearby Cleveland was becoming a hub of automobile and bicycle making in the USA, and both need not only tires but other rubber components, it was time to get into the rubber business and make anything rubber for vehicles and any other domestic non-vehicular uses. Since the company would be public, Frank chose to honor the man that sowed the seeds of modern rubber, Charles Goodyear. The first stock offerings attracted many investors, with a Mr. David Hill, who purchased $30,000 worth in shares, becoming its first president. Frank set up the factories to make whatever they could with rubber: gaskets, horseshoe pads, shoe soles, but poker chips, tires, and the concern was immediately successful. Being a skilled engineer, Frank began to design new machines to improve the process, quality, and speed of manufactured rubber goods. He patented 19 such improvements, the most well-known being the Seiberling State Tire Building Machine. In the car tire world, this machine was as much of a game changer as Henry Ford's implementation of the moving assembly line to car manufacture. With Seiberling's machine, the needed materials are fed into it, which in turn forms them onto a drum. Then it would press and fit the tire together with great precision and balance, trimming the tire automatically for high quality and uniformity. Within 5 years, more than half of the tires made in the USA were done on Frank's machine. Frank Seiberling remained as general manager from 1898 through to 1906, when he would become the 4th president of Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. He would lead Goodyear through to 1921, when he left to form a new company under his name. Frank made his fortune in the rubber business, yet in so doing honored the man that made it possible. Both men knew adversity. Both men were brilliant inventors, and Charles Goodyear hoped that the seed he planted would be well harvested, and Frank Seiberling would be the only such harvester to reap in the name of the father of modern rubber. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.